Nathan, how the heck do you get on 900 podcasts? Let me start right there.
Yeah, it's funny because I started off being an Amazon seller, right? And you're kind of behind the scenes. No one knows who you are. It's not B2B. You're not really, even back then, you weren't really networking. Now there's Amazon conferences and stuff, but it was very secretive and you're kind of hiding behind whatever your seller name is. And your seller name doesn't really matter because all that matters is Amazon. And
Right.
when we started FreeeUp, it was our first B2B business. We essentially took a lot of the VAs and freelancers from our Amazon business and started offering them to other e-commerce sellers. And we got to learn B2B. We got to have our own website, which was cool, and learn branding and learn partnerships. And we started to experiment with what is the best way to get in front of our target audience. And it just so happened that podcasts were becoming more popular. I think Entrepreneur on Fire, you've probably heard of. That was like one of the first big business podcasts. And I was lucky enough to get on that before they started charging. And for me, it kind of opened my eyes being like, hey, if I go on every e-commerce podcast, I'm going to get in front of thousands of e-commerce sellers. And that was just a great way to grow the business. Now, I didn't know all the other stuff that went with it. Like you got backlinks, you built network and partnerships with the hosts and all the other things that were great. But essentially for 4 years of FreeeUp, I was just going on every podcast I possibly could. Now I'm a little bit more picky and I turn down a lot of podcasts. But back then I was just saying yes to everything. And there was even a week where I did 5 podcasts a day, 5 days in a row, 25 in a week. By Friday, I couldn't talk. But I mean, it was worth it. It got us in front of lots of people. And it was definitely a great way that we grew our brand. And before it was our top marketing strategy. Now it's just one of our many marketing strategies.
So for somebody listening, I've done podcasts as well, quite a few, I think around about 50, right? Compared to 900, not that much. But I'm curious, what would you recommend somebody who is trying to get on bigger podcasts, or at least on the kind of podcasts that are really relevant to their target audience?
Yeah, so we have a podcast outreach formula. If you go to outsourceschool.com/podcast, and it's essentially how we have a VA pitching podcasts for us. And it's like anything else in business. How do you get really good leads? How do you get really good partners? The same thing applies for podcasts. It's doing your research to figure out which ones they are and having some basic check marks like, do they allow guests? Are they still active? Have you been on it before? Then you kind of look at, okay, how many episodes have they had? Who's their target audience? And get a little bit more picky there. And it's really outreach and follow up and using your network to get on other podcasts. So for like right now, I'll be talking to people and they hear I go on podcasts and they'll say, oh, I know Bob, I know Joe, and they'll kind of get me that in. Or I'll just be pitching podcasts consistently. If you're pitching 5 to 10 podcasts every day, which doesn't take you that much time, but again, you can use my outreach formula to do it. Eventually, you're going to get on a lot of podcasts and you might have to follow up. I've gotten creative ways where there was this really big Amazon podcast with Scott Volker that I couldn't get on. He rejected me for like 2 years. And every 6 months, I would just follow up nicely, no pressure, not being pushy, just being like, hey, I really think it would be a good fit. Here's a value I could add. And then I started grabbing testimonials of FreeeUp clients that were also in his community. And I said, hey, here's your community that's using my service, that's vouching for it. And then he finally let me on, and then he invited me back a few times after that. So sometimes you have to get creative, but I'm a big fan of follow-up, and you don't want to be like, you got to take rejection as what it is. Like, people are busy, people get pitched all the time. It's not a personal attack on you. It just means that you have to follow up in a nice, respectful way.